Hey, this is Andrew Brown from ExamPro, and we are taking a look at Azure API Management. So this integrates existing backend services into modern API gateways. And this service, there's a lot to it. So we're going to be doing quite a bit here, maybe more than we have to, but it is a very powerful service, especially if you're trying to be a developer on Azure. So we're going to just make sure we spend a good amount of time with it. So it follows the API approach of decoupling the front end and back end teams with the help of API mocking. The Azure API Management handles the full management of your APIs. It centralizes the securing, versioning, documentation, and compliance from your backend services in a single endpoint. So very powerful tool, but let's get to it. So let's go over key concepts or key components of API management. I do not have a fancy visual for this. It's just very hard to visualize, but we will learn all this stuff as we go through it. So let's talk about what we have here. So we have an API that represents a set of operations. API operation, which connects an API endpoint to its backend. We have a product, which is a logical grouping of APIs. A single or group of APIs make up a product. So this is how your APIs are presented to developers. So it can either be public or private. We have a backend that represents backend services in your API. There are groups. These are used to manage the visibility of products to developers, such as administrators who have full access to the API management, developers who are users with access to the developer's portal with permissions to build applications, guests, users without access to the developer portal, but with the reading permissions in some services. There's the idea of developer. So this belongs to a product group, and each developer has a primary or secondary key to call that product's API. There are policies, configurations, and validations that are applied in progress to incoming requests and outcome responses, which you will see in closer detail in the upcoming slides. There are named values. So these are key value pairs used with policies. Values can be a result of an expression. There are gateways. So this is where your API calls and are received, and policies are applied to incoming requests. Then there's the developer portal. So this is where developers can access all the APIs and products listed by your APIM. Alongside the APIs, operations, and documentation, developers can also request access to your APIs from the developer portal. But again, we'll figure this out as we go through it, okay? All right, let's take a look here at the Echo API service. So when you create APIM gateway, that's the first thing you'll do. You'll get by default this thing called Echo API. And I was like, whoa, what is this thing? I wasn't sure what it was. And I thought it was kind of interesting. That's why I expand upon it here, which I didn't really see much of it in the documentation. So I had to piece things together. But the idea is that Echo API provides a bunch of existing endpoints. And these are mocked endpoints to a non-production Azure service used to test Azure API management. So, if you don't have an API yet, but you want to interact with it, it's going to go to the service called echoapi.cloudapp.net/API. And again, it's just a dummy application to test against. So that's what that is. So if you see it, you don't need it. You can absolutely delete it, but you always get one when you create a gateway, okay? All right, let's take a look at the feature comparison for APIM, because it's one of those services where there's a lot of features, but they're not always available to you depending on what plan, subscription, what kind of user you are. So let's take a look at how the features change based on what plan you're using. So across the top, we have consumption, developer, basic, standard, and premium. Red is what's not available for that particular plan. Green is what is. So for Azure AD, we do not have it for consumption or basic. For virtual network support, it's just not supported for consumption, basic, and standard. For multi-region deployment availability zones, we're only getting that for premium. For multiple custom domains, premium as well, and also for developer portal, the built-in cache, and built-in analytics are not available in the consumption plan. If you want a self-hosted gateway, it better be on the premium. Basically, almost developer always says yes because you have to play around with things, right? So TLS settings is for everyone, external cache is for everyone, client certificate authentication policies are for everyone, which is very generous. Back and restore you're not going to get in the consumption model. And that's not all. We got a few more here. So if you want management over Git, direct management API, Azure Monitor logs and metrics, static IP, or WebSockets API, you're not getting those in the consumption model. Now, Graph API, GraphQL API is available for all of them. So there you go. All right, let's take a look at API authentication. So in order to authenticate with our APIs, we configure those settings under our subscription setting. So it's as simple as doing a checkbox there. So if the subscription is required, only developers with a valid access key can use it. And so the idea here is we can configure where the API will receive those access keys, which can be sent as the header or query string. So there are some options there. If this thing is not checked, then that means anyone that is anonymous has requests will be allowed. So it's as simple as having that checkbox there and having a key. So there you go. All right, so let's take a look here at groups for APIM. So groups are used to manage the visibility of products to developers. And so we can break these down into some broad categories. We have administrators. So they manage API management service instances and create the API's operations and products that are used by developers. Then we have developers. They are authenticated for the developer portal. That users that build applications using your APIs. Developers are granted access to the developer portal and build applications that call the operations of an API. Then you have guests. So these are unauthenticated developer portal users, such as prospective customers visiting the developer portal. They can be granted certain read-only access, such as the ability to view APIs but not call them. So administrators can also create custom groups or use external groups in an associated Azure Active Directory tenant to give developers visibility and access to API products. A user can belong to more than one group. So there you go. All right, let's take a look here at frontends and backends, starting with frontends. So frontends define the route or endpoint and the documentation configuration around that endpoint. So the idea here is we have frontend and we have a single method here, which is post/resource. And if we were to open that up, you can see that we have, I'm just getting my pen tool out here, we have a description for our documentation, the display name, the name, I can't remember what the difference for the name is, but it's called create resource. We can set its URL, its method, and then down below we have additional parameters. So API does not host APIs, but it creates facades for your APIs. That's a key thing to remember. API, so API management, it does not host APIs. It's creating a facade for your APIs. So let's take a look at the backend. So for backends, you can set the following types. You can set a custom URL, so point to a server where your service is running. You can say to go to Azure Resources, integrate directly with a resource, such as Azure Functions, App Service, Container App, Logic App. I'm just missing the P there, but it's two Ps. So you have the idea up here where we can see custom URL, Azure Resource, Azure Service Fabric. Okay. We have some additional options here. So we can authorize credentials that present requests credentials to the backend service. There are options like headers, so that's HTTP headers. We can fetch from named values. We can query based on query string. You can fetch from named values there as well. You have control of client certificates, so X509 certificates, which we do talk about in this course, which are stored in Azure Key Vault, which is the section that we're talking about there. So you're just seeing those options, headers, queries, and client certificates. But yeah, there you go. All right, let's take a look here at policies for APIM. So API management policies allow you to change the behavior in multiple stages of your endpoint's request lifecycle. You can update any part of the request response message, such as the headers, bodies, URLs. And there are 4 areas where policies can be applied. We have inbound for incoming requests, backend before requests reach your backend, outbound before sending responses back to the client, and error when a request encounters an error. Just to kind of visualize it, we have our front end, incoming processing, back end, outbound processing. And so the idea is that here for the inbound processing, that's where we have policies apply. That's the one they're talking about right here. And then we have for the back end, so before requests reach your back end, outbound processing, and then error is not visualized because it would be whenever an error would occur here, okay? Azure has a collection of policy groups which contain many policies you can apply. And we got a big list here. We have access restriction policies, advanced authentication, caching, cross-domain transformation, Dapr integration, validation policies, GraphQL. So there's a lot of great policies that we can already utilize. When an error occurs, no other policies are applied except the error policies. However, if other policies were in effect prior to the error, they will not be removed. Product level policies apply to all API operations within a product. So now let's go take a look at an example of a policy, okay? All right, let's take a quick look here at a policy example. So you're going to see this policy here, and we are doing it right on the Echo API. So this is for an outbound policy to cache the response in a GET operation. I believe that all those policies are in the documentation. You can easily copy and paste them in. We do a follow along for policies. That was something I definitely covered. I just don't remember if it was part of the system or, I mean, it must be because it says here retrieve resource cache. But anyway, the idea here is that this policy stuff is in an XML language. Not super important to learn what it is, but the fact is that there is a lot of available policies available for us, so we can pretty much copy paste and figure it out from there, if that is clear. And here is kind of another visualization that I just want to show you relating to our policies here, just because it kind of maps up my little graphic where we have the front end, the inbound processing, the outbound processing here. But if you notice here, it says policies. I know it's really small, but you can see it says base, cache lookup, rewrite URL, and here it says base, and then cache store. So the idea is you can see what policies are being applied there. So there you go. All right, so what we're going to do here is look at all the possible policy groups that are provided by Azure. And when I say policy groups, I mean the policies within those policy groups. So you get an idea of what kind of policies you can do to transform, manipulate, filter during transit of a request from a response through APIM. We're not going to look at all the code examples, but I'll pull out a couple per policy group here. We're starting with access restriction policies. So the first is check HTTP header, so enforce existence or value of HTTP header. Then we have limit call rate by subscription, so prevents API usage spikes by limiting call rate on a per prescription basis. That's pretty cool. When you look at other providers like AWS, where they have API Gateway, there is like a fixed limit on there. I don't remember there being any kind of policy to do that, so I like how you have the flexibility there to choose. Hopefully it's on there by default in that base. I don't know. Limit call rate by key, so prevent API usage spikes by limiting call rate on per key basis. Restrict caller IP. So filter, so allow or deny calls from specific API addresses or add an address range. That could prove very useful. Set usage quota by subscription, so allows you to enforce a renewable or lifetime call volume and or bandwidth quota on a per subscription basis. Set usage quota by key, so allows you to enforce a renewable or lifetime call volume and or bandwidth quota on a per key basis. Validate JWT, so enforces existence and validity of a JWT JavaScript web token, extracted from either a specified HTTP header or a specified query parameter. JWT is very common for authentication of client-side applications. Validate client certificate, so enforces that a certificate presented by a client to an API management instance matches specified validation rules and claims. Let's take a look at that restricted caller IP. Very, very simple. We define IP filter, we have an action, the IP address that is allowed in this case, or a range. So that one is, again, very simple. These are not hard to figure out. We have validate JWT. So there is some stuff there, and it is what it is. Okay. So we'll go on to advanced policy. So here we have control flows. So conditionally applies policy statements based on the evaluation of Bool expressions. Forward request, so forwards the request to the backend service. Limit concurrency, so prevents enclosed policies from executing by more than the specified number of requests at a time. Log to event hub, so sends messages in the specified format to a message target defined by a logger entity. Emit metrics, so send custom metrics to application insights at execution. Mock response, so aborts pipeline execution and returns a mocked response directly to the caller. Retry, retries execution of the enclosed policy statements, and if and until the condition is met, execution will repeat at the specified time intervals and up to the specified retry count. Return response, so aborts pipeline execution and returns the specified response directly to the caller. Let's take a look at limit concurrency. That seems like a good one to have. So here we have an inbound, and then we define our backend. We set our limit concurrency. It's setting the forward request to a timeout of 120. So prevent and close policies from executing by more than the specified number of request time. We have mock response. That one would be very, very useful. Like you just want to, you don't want to have a real response. You just want to put whatever you want in there. So it gives back a status 200 for application JSON. More advanced policies here. So send one-way request, send a request to a specified URL without waiting for a response. Send request, send a request to a specified URL. Send HTTP proxy, so allow you to route forward requests via HTTP proxy. Set variable, persist a value in a named context variable for later access. So here's an example of one where we're setting that variable. So we're saying, is it mobile? And we want to know, is it mobile? So the idea is it'll take that value from that agent, and then we'll have that variable available for us to determine, was the request mobile? We have wait, so wait for enclose, send request, get value from cache, or control policies to complete before proceeding. Set request method, allow you to change the HTTP method for a request. Set status code, change the HTTP status code to the specified value. Trace, adds custom traces into the API inspector output, application insight telemetries, and resource logs. Looking at authentication policies, and I don't know why that's highlighting. Oh, I probably have a graphic above it, that's why. So we have authenticate with basic. So authenticate with basic service using basic authentication, very common for test environments. Authenticate with client certificate, so authenticate with a backend service using client certificate. Authenticate with managed identity, very popular use case for Azure services. So authenticate with a backend service using managed identity. So there's an example, basic auth. That's a username, password. You've probably seen it if you've ever gone to a site where they just give you kind of like an alert. You have to enter those two in. And for this one, you can see that it's going to Vault for the managed identity. Caching policies, so get from cache. Perform cache lookup and return a valid cache response when available. Probably a very popular policy to be used. Store to cache, cache response according to specified cache control configuration. Get value from cache, retrieve a cache item by key. Store value in cache, store an item in the cache by key. Remove value from cache, remove an item in the cache by key. So here, the example is obviously very big for get from cache, but here it says vary by developer, cache key lookup. So I guess you're giving it these things. Now, sometimes they're not always very clear when you're reading them, but that's fine. For cache store value, so store value, you provided a key. There is the value. The duration I'm assuming is how long it lives for, maybe the TTL. Cross-domain policies. So we allow cross-domain calls. This is something you probably really, really would want to enable, especially if you're building applications that are not on the same domain. So I could see people using this quite a bit. Makes the API accessible from Adobe Flash, Microsoft's Silverlight browser-based clients. Did not expect that as a description. Cores, I was thinking of cores, that's why. Add cross-origin resource sharing, support to an operation or API, allow cross-domain calls. I feel like this one's going to happen a lot. I didn't know Microsoft Silverlight still existed. If people don't know, Silverlight is a competitor to Adobe Flash output. I guess Adobe Flash probably does HTML5 now. I'm just thinking of old Flash players. JSON-P adds JSON with padding, support to an operation for an API to allow cross-domain calls from JavaScript browser-based clients. So that is the cross-domain one, very simple. There's cores, and if you've ever seen cores, this looks the same. If you're on AWS, if you're ever anywhere else, it's the same XML. It looks the same. So it looks big, but it's not as scary, and you'll come across it quite often, especially with APIs. Transformation policies, convert JSON to XML, converts request or response bodies from JSON to XML, convert XML to JSON. You get it. Find or replace a string in a body, mask URL in the content, set backend service, set body. These are very clear. Set HTTP header, set query string parameter. If you want to read these, you can, but they're very straightforward. Rewrite URL. That's probably a very popular one, but maybe the example is too large, so I don't show it here. Transform XML and XSLT. Let's look at XML to JSON because I thought that one was kind of interesting. So you say XML to JSON. And I guess it just turns it into JSON. HTTP header, something very common that you'll be doing. You can just set a header for whatever values you need to pass along. We have Dapr integration policies. So send request to a service, send message to pub subtopic, trigger output binding, And there's an example of a trigger output binding. Validation policies, this is the last group. Validate content, validate parameters, validate headers, validate status code, validate GraphQL request. So we'll take a look at parameters. So here's an example where we have a parameter and it says prevent, detect, prevent, ignore. So I guess the idea is it's just saying, like, if those parameters are present, allow them. If not, ignore them. Validate status code. I figured this would be like a little bit more interesting, this one, but it's not. Status code, so prevent unspecified status code action. So do not allow it to have an unspecified code action. I didn't know that that's possible. I thought status codes are always returned, but I guess you're learning something new every day. But those are all the policy groups, and hopefully you get an idea of policies you can apply, because that's the greatest power of APIM is those policies. Okay. All right, let's take a look at different ways we can define APIs within APIM. So the idea here is that you're ready to create an API. You have a gateway, you want to create an API. So you hit that Add New API button. You got a bunch of options here. So you can define one manually via HTTP endpoints, WebSockets, GraphQL. Of course, that's going to vary what you want. WebSockets is great for real-time stuff. Maybe you're making a video game. Maybe you're making a chat app. GraphQL is becoming a popular alternative to REST-based applications like standard endpoints. So GraphQL allows you to define a query to query data. Personally, it's not my favorite, but I like the fact that it's all rolled up under one API gateway in Azure. The next thing is we can define based on a schema standard for importing, defining APIs. We have OpenAPI version 3, WADL, WSDL, and the latter two I don't know much about. And so following this video, we're going to go talk about these three standards here because I do think it's important to know all the three, because that's the real way you're going to really get APIs into here. You're not really going to be doing it manually. And then the last one is really great if you want to spin up an API that you know you want to integrate right away. Very common ones would be app service. Actually, I guess all three of them, really, to be honest. Logic app or app service or function app. And I'm pretty sure in this we will show you with function app in the follow along there. So those are some options there just to get quickly started. But let's take a deeper look at these open definition standards for defining APIs and then importing them, starting with OpenAPI. All right, let's take a look here at OpenAPI. So here is an example of one written in YAML. I have a feeling that it can also be done in JSON, but just taking a quick look here, you can kind of get an idea. You have paths. That is an endpoint or a method if you want. The method that to be used would be post here. You can provide a summary description, the contents, should it be application JSON, schema information, and what responses should come back. So pretty straightforward. It gets a little bit more complicated than that, but that is the best snapshot I can provide to you of that language. So OpenAPI specification, OAS, defines a standard language agnostic interface to RESTful APIs, which allows both humans and computers to discover and understand the capabilities of the service without access to source code documentation or through network traffic inspection. And OpenAPI is really the leading one. This is what pretty much everybody uses nowadays. No matter what cloud service provider you go to, they're going to have an option for their API gateway to import OpenAPI. Swagger and OpenAPI used to be the same thing, but as of version 3 of OpenAPI, Swagger and OpenAPI are two different things. So OpenAPI is a specification. Swagger are tools for implementation. For the specification, if you want to use, I think it's like Swagger, it's by BearSmart, and BearSmart, I believe, is the one that came up with OpenAPI to begin with. And so OpenAPI can be represented as either JSON or YAML, as I said earlier, but there you go. Let's take a look at WADL and WSDL. They're very similar. That's why we're giving them one slide together. So Web Application Description Language, WADL, and then Web Service Description Language, WSDL. These are specifications defined by the Web Consortium. Was it W3G, W3 something? W3C probably. And I believe that WADL was originally made by Sun Microsystems. I don't know who made WSDL, but it definitely is under the W3C. And here's an example of WSDL. very, very, very heavy because it's all XML. Most people like JSON and YAML. That's why OpenAPI is so popular. But just taking a look here at WADL and WSDL, the idea is that you will have some things that are similar. So with WADL, you define an application. For WSDL, the equivalent is definition. Here we have grammars, here we have types, here we have resource, here we have interface, method, operation, request response, input, output, param, element, param, simple type. To me, WADL looks more like like how we would describe in terms of terminology. I cannot remember which one is more advanced because one has more capabilities than the others. But to be honest, you're not going to be using any of these. You're going to be using OpenAPI, but I just wanted to show you them and the fact that you can translate their XML over to that there in this table. So hopefully that gives you kind of an idea. There you go. Let's take a look at the developer portal. So the developer portal is an automatically generated, fully customizable website with the documentation of your APIs. It's where API consumers can discover your APIs, learn how to use them, request access to try them out. So here is an example of the default one that you get. To be honest, I did not know how to use this. I tried really hard because I thought it was a very cool idea. And this is actually the second iteration of the developer portal. So there was an older one that was different from this, but this is the new one. And I like the idea, but in execution, I'm not sure exactly what to do here. But the idea here is you need to publish, you'll need to publish for the developer portal to be publicly viewable. You can save revisions of the portal to quickly roll back to previous versions. You can apply custom domain for your developer portal. So the idea here is, there's on the portal overview to see it, there's a link there that you click and that's how you view it. Not available in the consumer plan, available in all the other plans. I guess the idea behind the developer portal is like, if you're trying to sell a cloud service, but it's API driven and they just pay to access the developer portal. Or I guess it's also to read the documentation for people that need to utilize it. In theory, I like the idea. In execution, I don't know. All right, so there is authentication for the developer portal that you can set. There's a few different ways to do it. You can do Active Directory, B2C, identity providers like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, basic authentication, which is the default version. If you're not familiar with basic auth, the idea is you can enter a username and password that gets prompted to you. So not super complicated. There's also delegated authentication, which allows you to use your own web app sign-in, sign-up process, product, subscription instead of the built-in developer portal, built-in functionality. And just to figure out where that is, under the developer portal, you have identities. You can add those. You can see there's delegation down below. So not super complicated, but yeah, there is authentication for the API, and then there's authentication for the developer portal. So just make sure you understand the distinction of those two because it does get a bit confusing. Well, let's talk about caching. So we have a built-in cache and an external cache. So API and operations in the API management can be configured via response caching. When we're looking at policies, we had an indicator as to how caching works. Response caching can significantly reduce latency for API callers and backend load for API providers. So we're going to just provide a caching policy to the outbound or other places. Built-in cache is volatile and is shared by all units in the same region in the API management service. So for that reason, you have the ability to set an external cache via Redis. So that would be using Azure's Redis cache service. So using external cache allows you to overcome the few limitations of built-in cache. So avoid having your cache periodically cleared during API management updates. Have more control over your cache configuration. Cache more data than your API management tier allows. Using cache with the consumption tier of API management. Enable caching in the API management for self-hosted gateways. You simply need to provide a connection string to your Redis cache. So there you go. All right, so after a really, really, really long wait, like 40 minutes, and I was able to do like so many other follow-alongs while waiting, this is ready. So very long time, 30, 40 minutes. We'll go to the resource here. And so we have this environment set up, and we're going to have to actually have something to route to. And so the idea is that we want to set up a container app. And so before we can go ahead and do that, we're going to need to create a container app. So what you'll do is open a new tab. All right, and we're going to search for containers, and then we have container apps. And so what we'll do is go ahead and open that. And then from there, we'll go ahead and create ourselves a new container application. Container app is a little bit better than container instances. I don't know if this came afterwards or just serves a different purpose, but container apps is pretty nice. So what we'll do is say, we'll create, or actually we don't need to create one, but we'll use the same namespace. So my APIM. And we will call this one my container. Doesn't really matter what we call it. For the region, does this have a region or is this a global service? It feels like it should be a global service. I don't think we chose a region. It says Central US. I'm just going to stick to the same thing just in case. Just a good way when you're doing labs. And we're going to start with a simple hello world container. So we're just going to make it super easy for us. Don't have to do any coding to get an application running. We're going to go ahead and do create. And so now we just need to wait for that to deploy. It shouldn't take too long. So I'll see you back here in a moment. All right, so after waiting, I don't know, like 4 or 5 minutes, it looks like our environment is set up or our container is deployed. So we clicked into it and there should be, there it is, application URL. So if we just open that in a new tab, you should see this. And that is what we're going to try to route to for APIM. So what we'll do is make our way back over to APIM. We'll go ahead and create a container app. And here we can go browse and select our container. So to make it super, super simple for us, super easy, as you can see. I'm going to look at full for a second to see if there's anything interesting there. Nothing that I care about. We'll go ahead and hit create. So yeah, they make it really, really easy. And so once that's configured, we just need to observe that this API actually works. So we'll give it a moment. Okay, there we go. So after a few minutes, there it is. So let's just test that our API is working now. This web app is an HTML page, so it's not really what we'd want to return, but it's the easiest example that we can set up here. So I'm going to go to the GET request here. And from there, I'm going to go to test. And we are going to see that it's going to send a request here. Notice that it's sending the subscription key. So this is what we normally have to pass along, which is over here. We'll do that in a different follow along here. We'll go ahead and hit send. And we'll give it a moment. And we get some data back. So it's the HTML page. It's what we're looking for. Welcome to Azure Container App. So that is great. So we're done here. We'll keep this environment around for the next few follow-alongs. But there you go. Hey, it's Andrew Brown, and we are continuing on with APIM. And this time around, what we want to do is actually work with some subscription keys, because here we are just hitting the button. That's not how we're going to use our API, right? So let's go over and set up a new product. Before we do that, I'll go over to subscriptions. Let's just show you that we do have some keys here. And notice there's one called service. It came with a product and a limited one, but this service one is actually being used in our APIM. So when we were testing, that was the key that it was using. So if we go back to APIs and we click into our here, my container, and we go to get, somewhere here, if we go around, I'm just going to click around here, settings, test, down below, send. I think it gives us some information so we'll know what key it's using. So here we can see the key somewhere, or it should tell us. I do know that it's using the service key. I can't remember how I know that, but I know it, okay? And so the idea is that we want to create our own key, I guess, at some point, but we'll go for product and we'll make a new one. I'm going to call this developers. Actually, I'm going to call it junior developers because originally it was developers, but I'm just going to do junior developers just so we're not conflicting. We'll hit publish, so that's okay. And we need to add our API. So here we'll choose my container. We'll go ahead and create it. So we'll just say for junior developers, even though it's going to really have full access. And this is just a way that you can like catalog out your APIs or assign them to different groups. So it's a good way to organize your stuff, is to create them in products. And so if we click into here, you can see that there's APIs that's assigned. We can assign policies if we want globally for everything. We can change, we have some settings for access controls, and we have subscriptions. So we do already have the subscription key. We don't have to go and create a new one. But we should probably look at access controls because right now it's just set up as administrator access. We're going to go ahead here and add another one called developers. I believe you can add or create your own groups, but it's not super complicated, so there's no point in really talking about it. We do want to go get the primary key for this. So here, what I want you to do is click into here. And oops, actually, that's not what I want. There was nothing to change. I don't know why I hit save there. That was pointless. But what we'll do is go back to junior developers here, back in the products here. We'll go to the subscription side here because we need to see the key, which is here, junior developers. So if we go here and say show keys, now I can get the primary key. So we need that key because we actually want to make an API request. And this time we're going to use PowerShell for fun. So I'm opening up Cloud Shell up here in the top left corner. Make sure it's set to PowerShell. It always doesn't hurt to learn some PowerShell. We could do it in Bash, but let's do PowerShell. It's a bit easier to do that. And we'll give it a moment to spin up. If you're doing this for the first time, it might ask you to make a storage account. So you might have to press some buttons here. So just press whatever buttons it wants to get to this part, okay? And it doesn't normally take that long to spin up. There we go. So the first thing we're going to set is a URL. I'm just waiting for it to give me some more information. Yeah, still going. There we go. So we're going to set a new variable. Whoops, we'll type clear first. We'll type new variable. And this needs to be, well, first we'll do our subscription key because we already have it in our clipboard. Subscription key, double quotations, paste that in. It didn't actually grab it. So that's fine. I guess we'll go grab instead from APIM the gateway URL. So we'll get the gateway URL. That's the URL that we need to get to. Notice this is the overview blade in our APIM app. In order for us to, that's like the API endpoint you'd hit, right? So we'll type in URL and we'll paste that in. It really doesn't like the that, so we'll have to right click paste. It probably was working before for the subscription URL, we just probably had to right click. So we'll do subscription URL equals double quotations, and we will grab this key here again. So I'm just gonna scroll on down here, grab the primary key. You can use the secondary key, but you really don't need it. So we'll just paste that in here. So there we go. That looks like a key. So we'll hit enter. And now we need to set some headers. So I'm going to do @ curly's OOP APIM subscription key equals $ subscription key. You're wondering, what is all this stuff here? Well, in PowerShell, I believe this is called a dictionary. In other languages, they might call it a hash. You might think of a JSON object, but it's just a data structure that we need to utilize in order to pass this along. I'm just double checking to make sure I named it all correctly. We'll hit enter, and now we'll use the PowerShell command called invoke web request. I'm hitting tab to autocomplete. It's really nice that it does that. It'll do that even for the flags. So I'll do URL here. We'll do method. I think we don't have to specify the method because it'll already be get, but we'll do it anyway to be verbose. We'll do headers here, and we'll do headers. And we'll hit enter, and we have access denied due to missing subscription key. So here we have a small little problem. So I just got to double check to see what the mistake is. You know what? I was staring at this thinking like there's something wrong here. It's OCP. What OCP stands for, I have no idea. But we'll hit enter and we'll try again. And maybe we'll just print out the headers to make sure it's correct. There's no value in there. So we'll print out subscription key to make sure that is correct. Oh, because I wrote subscription URL. This is what happens when you don't type right. Okay, so not a big deal. Just learning a bit more as we go. And I just want to set that again, and then I'm going to print it out to make sure it's correct. There it is. And we'll invoke this, and we should get back HTML. A 200. So it says, welcome to Azure Container Apps. So that's how you can do a request. Of course, that's with PowerShell. Traditionally, you might use Postman, or you use your API, like an API to do that. But there you go. So yeah, that is how we work with a key, we generate our own subscription key, and work with it to make a request not in the UI. Okay, so I'll see you in the next one. We are still working with APIM, and this time we are going to create a policy, because policies are some of the most powerful things that APIM allows you to do. So what I want you to do is on the left-hand side, in our gateway that we created, we'll go to APIs, we'll go over to My Container, and what we'll do is we'll just click onto any of them, like Get Container. Actually, I want to make a new one. I'm going to call a new one called Mock, because we're going to do a mock request. So we'll do /mock. And if we go there and go ahead and create this, So if we were to use this right now, it shouldn't do anything. If we test this, what would we get back? We get a 404 not found because there's no page there. So what we'll do is we'll go here and we are going to go back to the design and we're going to add our own outbound process. So it doesn't matter what comes in. We're going to always have a mock response come back. And we're going to do that by adding a policy. So I'll go add a policy. You can see there's some basic ones like setting headers and things like that. We're going to go to other policies. We're going to get our policy structure back. And this is for the outbound. I don't know why we clicked through that to get to this. But the idea is that we're going to add a new policy here. So what I'm going to do is type in mock response APIM policy. And I'm just looking for all the ones here. So here's a bunch of policies. And we're just looking for the mock one. It's not a very verbose or sorry, like very flexible one. You just basically set the code, but it does work. So what we'll do is just paste that on in there. And we'll say we want this to be a 200. And we can say whatever we want to get back. So like if we want a different type, like, I don't know, CSV file content type. It'd be text CSV. It doesn't matter. We can do whatever we want. Application MS Word, right? Like, I'm not sure what would happen, but let's do it for fun. Could have just done JavaScript, but no, let's make it complicated. And so now, if we were to go to this mock request, and we were to test it, and we'd send it, let's see what we get back. Okay, it says 200 mock, and I mean, it doesn't complain about the content type, but let's just do this up in Cloud Shell just to make sure that we know what we're doing. So we were doing that before, so we're going to do it again. Okay. It's good practice. So we'll just test our new endpoint, make sure it works. This drag is sometimes weird, so I clicked it, and then it's just like, it's still dragging. It's very frustrating. Sometimes you have to frickin' open it up like that. So silly. But yeah, what we'll do is we'll just do a bit of PowerShell again and get this working. So I'm just Dell. We'll check in on how to do that. So the first thing is we need the URL. What if we hit up? Oh, we still have our stuff from before. So yeah, you want to set a URL for the gateway. You want to set a subscription key from before. We did that in the last follow along. And then we need the headers. But it's slightly different here because the URL needs to be /mock. And then what we can do is invoke a request. We get back a 200. So no issues there. So there you go. That's all it takes to set a policy. There's obviously more complex policies there, but this is a simple example because you really got to go digging through these here, and it's not really worth it to do that unless you actually are doing it for real. But there you go. So what we'll do is clean this up. We're all done with APIM. Look for that there. Delete this. And there you go. So that is APIM, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hey, Brian here again from ExamPro. Thank you for watching the video. Much, much appreciated. If it really helped you out, then don't forget to like, and if you want to keep learning, then go ahead and subscribe, and we're going to have all sorts of cool cloud content. If you're prepping for certifications or exams, or just want to learn more in a more structured way, you can go to exampro.co, and you get to see all sorts of awesome content there, including you get flashcards and quizzes and all sorts of great stuff. You could become a real professional on there. So go ahead, hop over there if you need to, or you can watch some of these videos that are popping up. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.